Criss by Lynn Ray Perkins. Chapter 18. In and Out of the Cocoon. When the idea came to Debbie that she needed a room of her own, and she was talking her parents into letting her have the spare room, an alcove off the living room that barely qualified as its own room, because it was the only other room there was, they pointed out how small it was. They pointed out that there was no door between the little room and the living room, just an arched opening in the wall. And they pointed out that the piano had to stay in there because there was nowhere else for it to go. Debbie, focused on her vision, said that was all okay. She didn't mind. So her mother made a drape and hung it from a rod inside the room, and they moved Debbie's bed and desk downstairs from the room she had always shared with Criss. She didn't admit to anyone that once all the furniture was in there, the room felt smaller than she had thought it would. It was only slightly more spacious than a storage locker, which it resembled, furniture arrangement-wise. Everything was right up against everything else. There was a small empty space in the center of the room where Debbie could stand up or sit down. Sitting down had to be done with crossed legs, or at least with bent knees. Still, sitting cross-legged in the middle of the floor or on her bed, she felt she'd found something. A sanctuary, though she didn't know from what. A secret entryway. To go where? She didn't know that either. The room had a small closet, which she had to share with a few of everyone's out-of-season clothes, some winter boots, and a couple of boxes. One of the boxes, a round hat box, held Helen Pelbury's collection of small figurines from when she was Helen Brand. They were wrapped in tissue paper that had been wrapped and unwrapped so many times that it was soft and crepey with folds and wrinkles. The figurines were all dogs, of different breeds, and made of different materials. Some porcelain, some wooden, some glass. There was a small, heavy, rounded one with perky, rounded ears, made of solid iron with blue-gray paint that had begun to chip and fall off, revealing dark metal and the beginnings of rust. There was another sitting dog, also of a geometric breed, but this one was tall and triangular, of creamy porcelain with polka dots and undog-like colors, persimmon and yellow and lime green. A dog that had been carved barking straight up into the air to fit into the rectangular shape of a block of wood. A carved Irish setter, painted china collies, black and white Scotty dogs that were salt and pepper shakers. There was a whimsical dachshund, twisted and snipped from a hot glass rod, light and delicate. There was a marble schnauzer, a brass poodle. Her mother never got them out and looked at them as far as she knew. Debbie was the one who had unwrapped and wrapped them all these times, since first discovering the box when she was 6 or 7. She liked taking them out and looking at them. When she asked about them, her mother said they were just souvenirs. There was nothing special about them. All the same, she didn't want Debbie to keep them out. She didn't exactly say why. Debbie arranged them on her desk, then wrapped them up and put the box back down in the closet. Then she hauled out the other box and lifted it onto her bed. This was also her mother's. It was a cardboard carton filled with scrapbooks, yearbooks, photo albums, and other odds and ends from Helen Pelbury's youth, her life before marriage. In the official photo albums, the ones that were kept in the bookcase in the living room, Helen had a brief childhood. She began as a toddler in white muslin, trimmed with lace. Standing in a doorway, her chubby hand on the doorknob, her serious face and her little hand in a wash of sunlight. She was momentarily a 10-year-old, in braids and a cowgirl outfit. A senior in high school, pretty and composed, in a sweater and a string of pearls. And then suddenly a bride, in a white satin dress with tiny satin-covered buttons from her wrist to her elbows and down her spine. All this happened in black and white on 3 pages. The cardboard box had more information, though still not enough. Debbie wasn't sure what she was looking for, what she needed to know. Helen Brandt's 17-year-old face smiled out of the yearbook page. She looked lively and confident. She looked poised. In some ways, the past looked like a nicer place than the present. More golden, even in black and white, with less cruddiness. Probably that wasn't true. She'd heard about the Depression, polio, and scarlet fever, about her grandfather coming home from work with his white collar gone gray, from all the soot and ash, just in the air, from the steel mills. Still, the girl in the picture looked like she knew how to make things be golden for her. How did she do it? Maybe that's what Debbie wanted to know. She pulled a wad of pamphlets and programs out of the box, propped her pillow against the headboard, and leaned back. The one on top was a booklet of instructions for crocheting lacy collars to set on top of a sweater or a dress. It seemed a little like putting glitter on a grocery bag, but many people in those days only had one sweater or one dress. It was hard to believe, but that's what her mother said, and that's how they spruced up for special occasions. The next booklet in the pile was a collection of recipes for faded holiday cookies, followed by a book put out by an aluminum foil company that showed a myriad of creative ways in which foil could be used, mostly unrelated to cooking and requiring dozens of square yards of foil. The effects were pretty spectacular. A swan centerpiece, for example, molded from crushed foil, holding a red rose in its beak, placed on a green tablecloth that was reflected, along with the light from 2 white candles, in every crinkle of the foil. As she flipped through a calendar year of special occasions expressed in aluminum, the voices of her mother and their neighbor Fran entered the living room from the direction of the kitchen and filtered in through the flowered curtain. "I wouldn't worry about it, Helen," said Fran. "It might never happen." "I'm not worried, really," said Helen. "It kind of makes you wonder, though." The sound of squeaking couch springs. They were settling in for a chat. Debbie picked up a program for the premiere of the screening of the movie Gone with the Wind. Apparently it had been a big deal. The program was 50 pages thick. "By the way," Helen was saying, "did I tell you that Debbie is going to go down to old Mrs. Bruning's house on Saturdays to help her out with housework? I guess she's very arthritic." Debbie's ears pricked up when she heard her name, and she half listened to her mother's version of the story. She usually sounded pretty good in her mother's stories, though not quite like herself. The stories themselves were that way too, more entertaining than what really happened, though close enough that you could think, "Oh, so that's how it was." Even if you had been there and it hadn't seemed that way at all, you could find out in this way that something you thought had been a disaster had actually come out quite well. In her mother's version of the Mrs. Bruning story, Debbie was a take-charge kind of girl who saw a frail old woman in distress and went right to the rescue. She didn't mind being cast by her mother as a heroine, but the way it happened was more accidental, and it was more equal. Mrs. Bruning lived in one of the older houses near the bottom of Prospect Hill Road. Her house was on a corner lot facing the side street. As you walked past it, up or down the hill, you could see into the backyard. The yard slanted up steeply away from a concrete patio, which was shaded by a corrugated fiberglass awning of faded yellow, held up by metal bars that enclosed ornamental scrolls, painted black, barnacled with scabs of rust. The house was built of gray stone and had a castle-y appearance, if you could sift it out from the awning, and the big doorway that had been fitted with plywood to accommodate a small modern door with a crescent-shaped window, the bent and cockeyed Venetian blinds hanging behind the loaded and stained glass windows, and the sun porch tacked onto one side, shingled up to the windows with roofing shingles in variegated shades of purple, brown, and green. Despite all of its prosthesis, Debbie thought that the ivy climbing up the stone, and the stained glass, and the small porch-like recess on the ground floor with the crenellated half wall gave the house an elegance and a personality. She had always wondered what it was like inside. She saw Mrs. Bruning out in her backyard and waved. Mrs. Bruning waved back. Then she held her hand up as if to say, "Wait a minute," and started making her way purposefully across the grass. She was short and solid, bottle-shaped. A bottle of vinegar or Pepto-Bismol with legs. She was one of those elderly women whose cleavage starts about 2 inches below her collarbone, and your main response to it is an intellectual curiosity about how that could even physically work. She moved toward Debbie with determination, but her steps were small, baby steps and effortful, as if each one was costing her. It was a big yard, so Debbie stepped into it and walked over to meet her to save time. Not that she was saving it for anything in particular. Debbie knew two things about Mrs. Bruning. One was that she'd never cut her hair. At least that's what people said. It may or may not have been true, but her hair seemed as if it might be pretty long. She wore it in a heavy braid arranged around her head in a complicated way, held in place with bobby pins. The hair closest to her scalp was white and fluffy, but as the braid narrowed, it became carrot-colored, then dwindled into a faded russet wisp weaving in and out of the pin-prickled coronet. It wouldn't have been that surprising to see baby birds peeping out over the top of it. The other thing Debbie knew was that when Mrs. Bruning's husband was still alive, the two of them had owned and operated the Idle Hour restaurant. They were German, from Germany, although they had been in America a long time. "It's going to rain," said Mrs. Bruning as they met. She was short. She only came up to Debbie's shoulder. It was an odd sensation, looking down at someone you felt you ought to be looking up to. Debbie was fairly certain Mrs. Bruning had been larger in the past. She looked at the sky, a dropped ceiling of soft gray wool. The air had a pre-rain stillness to it. "Yeah," she said. She said it pleasantly, but immediately wished she had said yes, or even yes, ma'am. Mrs. Bruning had that effect. "Yes," she corrected herself. "I think it is going to rain." "I can't get my laundry down from the clothesline," said Mrs. Bruning. "Oh?" said Debbie. She still thought they were just making conversation. "Why not?" she asked. It seemed like the next logical line in the conversation. "My hands," said Mrs. Bruning, "and my shoulders. Arthritis. For some reason they were working better this morning. I was able to hang it all up, but now they are so stiffened up on me, I can't do it. I can't get the laundry down, and it's going to rain." She looked at Debbie expectantly. She demonstrated how her arms would only go so high, how her hands would not do what she needed them to do. "You see what I'm saying?" she said. She had bright brown eyes like a bird's eyes. She didn't actually ask for help, but Debbie finally realized what she was supposed to do here. She glanced at the lowered sky, the waiting laundry, and Mrs. Bruning's knotted hands. "Oh," she said, "let me help you." The first cold heavy drops of rain fell on Debbie's shoulders as she carried Mrs. Bruning's laundry into the house where it was dark. Gray light hovered outside the windows, but it couldn't penetrate the ivy. Debbie bent awkwardly over her burden, the big basket piled high. "Where should I put this?" she asked. "I mean, where would you like it?" "Just in here," said Mrs. Bruning. She made her bulky way past the hall-filling obstacle of Debbie and the laundry, and a few seconds later a switch clicked and a light came on over a kitchen sink. "The overhead bulb is burnt out," she explained. "I can't reach it without climbing up on a chair, and then I'm afraid of falling. Just put it on the corner on the floor, and I'll take care of it later." Debbie nudged aside a small stack of newspapers with her foot and set the basket down. She stood up and turned around. The dimly lit kitchen seemed at first to be a cluttered, disorganized mess. But as her eyes adjusted, she saw spotlessly clean surfaces, polished fixtures. The impression of disorder came from a variety of projects that Mrs. Bruning had not managed to complete. A bag of groceries sitting on one of the chairs was only half unloaded, and what had been removed from it had only made it as far as the tabletop. Next to the cans of soup, standing in tidy rows along with a box of cereal and a loaf of bread, an old typewriter held a letter in progress. Just beyond that, a neatly folded file of bathroom towels, pink with roses, waited to be delivered to a closet somewhere in the murky house. A glass of milk and a plate with a partially eaten jelly sandwich sat nearby with a folded paper napkin tucked under its edge like a still life. On the counter by the wall were 2 boxes that had been neatly labeled Christmas ornaments, attic. The room was full of efforts, abandoned in midstream. Mrs. Bruning caught Debbie's gaze and laughed. She picked up the glass and the dish with the jelly sandwich and carried them to the sink. "And then again," she said, "maybe I won't." Over her shoulder, she added, "I'm going to have to think about it." Rain pelted the windows. The kitchens felt cozy. Yellow light from the shaded lamp illuminated a calendar printed on a dish towel hanging on the wall. The months and the verse above them were in German. Debbie was in her second year of German, and she could tell that the rhyme was about baking a cake, though she didn't know all of the words. Scheib, Scheib in Ofen nein, she read aloud. Why does it say not to put it in the oven? Mrs. Bruning looked at the dish towel, then back at Debbie. It's not nine as in no, she said. It's a shortened way of saying hinein, which means in there, as in shove it in there. A colloquialism. A slang word. I didn't think German would have slang words, said Debbie. It always sounds so precise, except for the sh and sh sounds. Mrs. Bruning chuckled. I can assure you, she said, we are as lazy as anyone else. Just take a look around you. Debbie did. I can change your light bulb for you, she said, and while she did that, Mrs. Bruning put the kettle on the stove to make tea and fished a package of vanilla sandwich creams out of the grocery bag on the chair. That's how it had started. They liked each other. Debbie tossed the Gone with the Wind program on the done pile and picked up a pamphlet called Just Us Girls. She had looked at it before. She had looked at all of them before. This one had a drawing of 3 females on the cover, a mother and 2 daughters sitting close together on a sofa. All 3 were drinking from the type of mug that might hold hot cocoa. Wavy lines indicating steam and warmth rose out of the cups. The mother and the younger daughter, who wore braids, were both in their nightgowns, robes, and slippers, and were listening intently to the teenage daughter, who sat between them in a beautiful evening gown. The idea was that she had just returned from a big date. She looked like the kind of girl who would have big dates frequently. The pamphlet had been put out by a sanitary napkin company, so there was a lot of information about periods and which company's products were best to use. Some of this information was not very modern, since the pamphlet was 30 or 40 years old. It talked a lot about being modern, though, and how lucky a thing it was to be modern. It seemed to suggest that emergence from the Dark Ages had been recent, a narrow escape facilitated largely by the sanitary napkin industry. There were also sections on health, grooming, and how to be popular. The popularity section was big on confidence. Debbie didn't feel a need to be popular, but she thought she would like to feel confident. The information on how to do this was vague. It mentioned being friendly, having good manners, and being clean and neat. She already did all that. Maybe not the neat part. But perhaps the exercises in the health section would help. She positioned the pamphlet open to the exercise page on her bed and moved to the epicenter of the room. By extending her legs past the desk into the space between her bed and the closet, she was able to do sit-ups and leg raises. A breeze. She stood up and aligned herself for toe touches. All of the exercises were easy. Confidence was oozing through her. The challenge was in doing the exercises without banging into the furniture. She stood in the small hollow of her cocoon and did arm circles. Small ones and medium. Large were not possible. She wondered if the confident feeling only lasted while you were actually doing the exercises. That could be inconvenient and awkward. Yesterday, for example, the last day of school, everyone clearing out their lockers of hairbrushes, gym clothes, mirrors, photos, and magazine pictures. They had to peel off all the tape. The lockers were going to be inspected. Debbie had a lot of tape to peel off, and she concentrated on that so as to not be undone by the protracted nearness of Dan Persick. She had, of course, tried to think of something to say, something really funny or interesting that would get his attention and reveal her true self. She was mistaken in thinking that's what it would take, but she was thinking it. She pictured herself now, pausing in her tape peeling to do a few arm circles. It would be hard to explain. Maybe she could have repaired to the restroom for a few minutes to do them there, but she hadn't. She had just peeled away silently, adding pathetic, scraggly layers to her sticky little ball of tape. A funny thing had happened, though, involving Dan Persick. When they were almost done, he'd said, "Oh, hey, Debbie." She'd looked up, startled bunny look, from where she was kneeling. He smiled and said, "I have something for you." He fished in every pocket of his jeans, then went through them all again, even pulling his front pockets inside out. Debbie waited, unable to imagine what would happen next. Something good? Something embarrassing? Her heart hopped up and down. "Geez," he said, "what did I do with it?" He went around once more and then said, "I guessed I lost it. Never mind. It was just something I found. I thought you might like it." There was a teasing note to his voice. Debbie didn't know what to think. She smiled, shrugged, and said, "Oh well." She thought she was quite cool under the circumstances. Mr. Disleski arrived at her locker, glanced at it, and told her she could go. "Have a nice summer," he said. "Yeah, have a nice summer, Debbie," said Dan. "See you around." "Thanks," she said. "You too." And walked down the hall and out through the doors into summer vacation, a place and time that promised many pleasures, but it didn't look like romance was going to be one of them. She put the pamphlet back into the box back into the closet, stretched out on her bed, and gazed up at the blank movie screen of her ceiling, the white walls of her cocoon, the blank arid desert of the summer. The voices of her mother and Fran, which had blurred into a murmur, now disentangled themselves and spoke alternately and distinctly. "I wonder if Mike will win again today," said Fran. "I hope he doesn't," said Helen. "He's won enough. It's someone else's turn." They were heading down to the basement. It was time for Jeopardy. Debbie went out to the front porch. Maybe a change of scenery would help. Maybe a miracle would help. Maybe nothing would help. End of chapter 18.